That is it. Items in front. And I'd like to bring Dan O'Brien to the stage.
I was hoping for that double applause that people get when, thank you. That they haven't tripped on the way to the podium or made a fool of themselves yet. Thank you for coming, this intimate crowd. I'm so excited to talk about playwriting at a conference that was founded in part by Tennessee Williams, and I feel like his ghost is somewhere very happy when we talk about theater and playwriting. I might anger him a little bit because I'm going to start talking about poetry. I hope that doesn't put off any playwrights. And I'm going to transition to talking about playwriting. I want to thank again Leah and Gwen and Adam and the staff, Brittany Allen, my co-workshop leader, and our workshop that has just been fantastic, just so talented. And so, thank you. So generous and so insightful. I'll pay you after for that. And all the other playwrights that I've been meeting from the other workshop, and the fact that there are 2 playwriting workshops now, it was just so exciting. I've been coming here long enough when it was always a kind of a lonely experience. Often poets and fiction writers would get up here and they'd say, I want to thank all the poets and the novelists for a wonderful conference. And the playwrights would be in back going, what the? But now we cannot be denied. So I'm going to be reading, I'm going to read. I don't teach full time. I'm not a scholar, if that's not obvious. So I write these craft lectures very personally, and they're kind of a memoir craft hybrid. And I've been doing this since 2017 when I was lucky enough to come back here after treatment for stage 4 cancer, when I was feeling reckless enough to accept the invitation to deliver a lecture. And it became something I wanted to do every year, even the years I haven't been here. Every summer, every year, I've wanted to write something else, but another aspect of playwriting craft and related to just how I'm trying to understand myself as a playwright. A little quick content warning. I mean, without being graphic, there are references to self-harm, to cancer, and to gun violence. So. But there are a few jokes in there as well. So I'm calling this Confession as Transgression. Afterwards, suggestions are welcome for better titles. My father was a lapsed Catholic. He wasn't an atheist when I knew him, but he wasn't exactly a team player either. He liked to joke about sadistic nuns and perverted priests. Our family went to church only seldomly, and even then it was an Episcopal church as a kind of compromise. It's kind of like Sewanee. Their priests were married. One was even a woman, and rumored to be a lesbian, no less. I found it thrilling. I was the only member of our large Irish-American family with any religious tendencies. I enjoyed the theater and the poetry. I would beg my mother to take me. The Sunday morning prayer was a respite from the emotional and verbal abuse in a family that was afflicted with an assortment of untreated mental illnesses. In my case, it was an obsessive-compulsive disorder that had developed seemingly in response to my older brother's suicide attempt, an event I had witnessed firsthand, or its immediate aftermath, when I saw him stumbling around the side of our house, shoeless and coatless and matted with snow, having just leapt from the attic window. This is all a preamble to stating that as a young, sometimes Episcopalian, I was never required to confess, which is probably why I felt compelled to write. What caught my eye was the surname on the spine, Sexton, and not for the ecclesiastical connotation, but because at age 12, the letters S-E-X in any context, any compound word seemed to erupt before my eyes like a roadside flare. I knew the slender book was poetry, but I was drawn libidinously toward it nevertheless. I sat down to read it in a corner cubicle of the library, and I heard the heart speak. Anne Sexton's confession was both terrifying and beautiful. Terrifying because of her shame and her exposure. Beautiful because it was the truth. And all the more beautiful because it was what she was not supposed to say. I swear I could feel her absolution. I read and reread all of Anne Sexton's work, and through her found my way to Plath, Lowell, Berryman, and their descendants. But the women moved me most. As an abused child, I identified with their oppression, and they reminded me of my mother, who was haunted by her own childhood, her memories of a physically abusive, alcoholic mother and a schizophrenic brother. My mother would often confide in me that she aspired to be a writer, but she never wrote. To do so would have required her to reveal too much. My first real poem, the first that was honest and therefore terrifying to write, was short, and I recall it easily more than 30 years later. Somehow derivative of Langston Hughes and Ezra Pound at once, the impulse was pure confession. My brother tried to kill himself. There's nothing more to say. Just like raindrops on a shaking black bough, he pushed us all. Thank God for snow. Where did I learn that confessional was a pejorative for writing deemed less than artful? Exhibitionistic, narcissistic, shameful, probably from my high school honors English teacher who was annoyed, if not affronted, by my juvenile poetic confessions. He would request my presence in his office after school and proceed to fastidiously interrogate my pages line by line, word by word. What did I think I was doing? Why would I believe that I had the right to write this sort of thing? Why do you write at all? He once asked me. My answer was arrogant but authentic, because I have to. That shut him up. He stared at me. I did not know in that moment, I do not know now, if he pitied or envied me. He was in his 60s, Irish-American, Catholic, unmarried. His favorite novel, reread yearly, he'd often brag, was Jude the Obscure. I felt vulnerable when I was alone with him behind his closed door, with the sun setting in his window and the cries of the other boys playing in the muddy fields below. At some point he told me that, like me, he had wanted to be a writer, but with age he had learned to, quote, repress the urge. This is why I suspect that many who label certain works of literature as confessional are repressed. They would simply prefer not to read about war, cancer, mental illness, to name a few of my usual subjects, or its miscarriage or abortion, or its unalloyed joy that puts them off, sex, or it's the political poem, political by subject or by presumption or declaration of a poet's tenets or identity that disqualifies itself as literature in their opinion. Many of us have these anecdotes. An editor emails that your recent submission made her wince, but feel free to try us again. The elder statesman poet has received your new collection, and while your subject is powerful, the poems he writes are not really poems. I'm reminded of Yeats's reservations regarding war poetry. I may be promulgating apocrypha, but I recall him writing somewhere that war is like a civilization driving itself violently into a roadside ditch, just some stupid, brutal accident. And accidents, I suppose, are unworthy of poetry. Though Yeats did write his poems about war, in the end, in his way. See also the author, actor, etc., Alan Bennett, who didn't write about his cancer for years because, quote, cancer, like any other illness, is a bore. There's no accounting for taste, of course, but bald assertions like these have always smacked of denial to me. If the raw subject does not repulse, the lack of distance might. These readers prefer the wall-mounted frame of the fictional, a suspension of disbelief in the autobiographical reality of the poem. For some, this depersonalization is a fundamental aspect of craft. I sympathize. I too have read work and written it that seemed to amount to little more than a verbal discharge of emotional dysregulation, journaling, not writing, as Truman Capote might as well have said. But I would argue that these poems were simply not well written or not well written yet. Time and perspective, reflection, and revision is almost always required, no matter the style or genre. A related put-down, the confessional work is therapeutic. Possibly I had never fully understood the definition. Pleasurable, restorative, providing psychological, emotional, or spiritual insight. Surely all art is pleasurable, restorative, revelatory for its practitioners in the first instance, then ideally for anybody who engages with the art afterward. To cite Yeats on my side of the argument, quote, all skill is joyful. There isn't a work of art that affects me that isn't in some way pleasurably therapeutic for me. Of course, one person's idea of pleasure may not be shared by others. It is somewhat surprising in a reality-starved, narcissistic age when novelistic memoir and autofiction is fashionable and popular that the autobiographical poem is regularly disavowed. Poets remark, often posted on social media in a state of high dudgeon, that not every poem is about the poet. This stance perplexes me. There are persona poems and narrative poems that present themselves as forays into theatrical and fictional terrain, but most of the poems I come across these days read like some strain of the lyric. So I presume that these poems are derived closely from the experience of the poet. That said, the autobiographical or even the autofictional work is not necessarily the confessional, as the latter always involves the exposure of the author's shame. At this point in the writing of this lecture, my brother died. I stopped writing for a while. I hadn't seen his death coming. Or rather, his death had been approaching for so long that I'd grown numb to its approach, its hovering proximity. There was no note. It may have been a heart attack or stroke, I am told. He was found by the building superintendent on the floor of his bathroom as if he'd been brushing his teeth before work or bed. The toxicology report will take months, several months. On his death certificate, the cause has been listed as undetermined. He was 53. There are those in the audience who would prefer that I did not divulge such information. But as usual in pain and shame, I am compelled. For the record, my brother long ago gave me permission to write about him and about our childhood together. Both my brother and I were estranged from our parents and from most of our siblings. It's your childhood too, he reminded me, and smiled with that weak, thin grin that never seemed to involve his eyes. I just won't read it. But I don't want to write about my brother now. What I want, other than his life restored and resumed, other than a happier life in the years leading up to his too early death, what I wish I could read is his confession. We barely knew each other. We might email on birthdays or holidays a few vague and friendly lines from him about his work as the IT director for the local government in our hometown. He never mentioned a partner or even a friend. I wish that he had recorded the truth about his life in exhibitionistic, narcissistic, confessional poems or prose or plays that I could look up in a library and carry with me to a corner cubicle so that I might sit and read and forgive him for his shame, his depression, and his self-loathing, so that I might love him for the beauty that I fear he could not recognize in himself. My brother gave me permission to write about him, but I don't know if he meant it. Maybe he was being polite. He was a hopelessly deferential guy. Maybe my poems and prose and plays and lectures about him caused him pain. I am worried in this moment that writing about him may have contributed to his depression and his death, whether it was by suicide or not. But I cling to what he told me. He didn't read my work. And he had advised my older sister, the only sibling with whom he was passably close, to do the same. She didn't take his advice. For years, she would email and telephone theaters and publishers to complain that my autobiographical writing was dishonest. She'd never offer any specifics. This is a quote. "I know that my brother is after the truth, but I don't think that I personally will ever understand what that truly is here," she wrote to the publisher of my most confessional poetry collection. She concluded with a rather passive-aggressive query. "Do you know if any of the great writers who revealed family secrets ever had their work filtered through a sibling's eyes?" My publisher conceded to me that my sister had an intriguing pitch here, but in the end he felt it was safer to decline. When my sister learned that I was writing a memoir, a prose memoir about my childhood, our childhood, she sent me a note card. Quote, "I do feel that writers have a responsibility to not only be truthful, but also to not cause harm with their words." She thanked me for considering her objections, and she signed her note sincerely. My parents have remained silent on the matter of my confessions. My father hasn't spoken or written a word to me since disowning me. The last I heard from my mother was a Hallmark condolence card, though nobody was dead. A decade ago, with only the pre-printed message inside, quote, "With each memory, we meet again with those we love, for the heart never forgives." Who knows what my mother was trying to say? At the time, I absorbed it as a threat, that my parents would never forget me, or that I would never be able to forget them and the long-term pain they inflicted on their children. I should explain that I was disowned because of honesty, mine and theirs. This was nearly 17 years ago. My brother was in the psychiatric ward again. I was home visiting, and one afternoon my parents lit into me for confounding, even silly reasons. I was an adjunct of creative writing. I had grown the requisite beard and shaggy hair, and I suddenly looked a lot like my father's counterculture, draft-dodging younger brother. My father told me as much, and more. "You look homeless," he said, "like a schizophrenic. You look like Allen Ginsberg." He shouted, which I found revealing because what was truly upsetting my parents was my writing, that I had begun to write not necessarily like Ginsberg, but autobiographically, writing without concealment or artful displacement. I knew in that moment, in the mess and tumult of a stupid, brutal argument, that I was at last perceiving the truth about my parents, the shame that they had labored to repress as long as I had known them, the shame that I had labored to hide from myself. "There are things you do not know," my father was shouting, again and again, spitting in my face, my mother cleaving to his side with a passion I'd never seen before. "We're just being frank," she cried. I learned a lesson, a craft lesson that day. The last time I saw my parents, writing honestly has the power to rupture and to liberate. My true stories released my parents' frankness and freed me from the decades-long delusion that they had ever truly loved me. Of course, honesty doesn't always tell the truth. An absolute truth is fictional, maybe mythical, and at best personal. We glimpse what is true for our story and our characters, and honesty is one tactic for approaching it. We dare not name it. But in the process of writing honestly, we may reveal other unintended truths about ourselves, our biases, limitations, and fears. An artistically defensible response to this inevitable self-exposure is to exploit the dilemma. The author inhabits the I in the confessional poem, the narrator in the work of memoir or autofiction, the protagonist in the autobiographical play. In all cases, a character examined and delineated as stringently as any other character, more stringently, as the most sympathetic justification for the indulgence of writing about oneself is the problem of an inner conflict that one cannot otherwise confront and resolve. At the core of every story is a poem, in my opinion, or in my process. Irreducible, intimate. The poem is many things, but it is also a germ, a seed, which is why this lecture began with poetry. But because I am a poet wrapped inside a playwright, I am both, I am conflicted. Midway through this lecture, I would like to examine the question of the confessional from the perspective of that most public mode of storytelling, the play. In the American theater, the frankly autobiographical play is an anomaly. We have a tradition of the memory play, of course, wherein a character, not necessarily the protagonist, stage manages the action with speeches delivered confidentially, often lyrically, to the audience. Consider Sewannee's benefactor Tennessee Williams and his Glass Menagerie, an auto-fictitious play about his early adulthood and his family. Tennessee is the aspiring poet Tom, his legal name, after all. His sister Rose is Laura, her limp is Rose's schizophrenia, and her mother, Edwina Williams, is the charismatically delusional Amanda Wingfield. But we don't see many memory plays these days, or not as often. Perhaps the presence of a character on stage in the act of recollecting distracts a modern audience from the immediate experience of what is being remembered. Perhaps audiences simply prefer what the theater and film and TV provide intrinsically, a multifarious embodiment of disparate, fully articulated individuals at odds with one another, a point-blank simulacrum of life. Perhaps audiences are simply used to what they're used to. The confessional play most frequently occurs as solo performance, or the one-person show wherein a performer, not always the playwright, tells their story, transforming themselves into supporting roles with the aid, perhaps, of various accents and hats. These plays are too often criticized for lacking in the dramatic dimension. Too much tell, the saying goes, not enough show. Shows with a singular character committing the supposed sin of extended storytelling can succeed, obviously. But the story being told needs to surprise and captivate to the degree that it overcomes or subverts the audience's expectations and reservations. Solo performance usually works best when structured as a full-length soliloquy, as a performer pursues the progression, crisis, and resolution of their inner conflict, simply because the lone breathing body on stage is the self-same performer. And audiences find it difficult to empathize with characters who are only talked about or who pass across the performer's visage and vocal cords like fits of spirit possession. Another critical component of a compelling one-person show is, in my opinion, an examination of a conflict between the performer's story and the story of the culture at large, a conflict that is between the writer and the audience. This is why the confessional solo show is often categorized as political theater. Let me step back for a moment and say that I'm by no means advocating for a movement of plays in which the playwright is the protagonist. I think this happens anyway, in a manner of speaking. The playwright's phantasmal presence in a play is always apparent if the play is risking anything. If the playwright has entered the arena of the stage to grapple with a subject that is privately, personally disturbing, the audience does not need the playwright's motivations and objectives made explicit for them. Indeed, in a non-confessional play, it is preferable and efficacious that the playwright's intentions remain subtextual, the better to sustain the illusion of the play's impartiality. But it is an illusion. Playwrights know that central to our craft is a transparent empathy with every character in our play, each an aching, palpable iteration of ourselves, or equally, we splinter ourselves into the strange multiplicity of our characters. This is why even a flagrantly fictional play is, behind the masks, unavoidably autobiography. This lecture is itself a solo performance. The substance of what I'm saying may be engaging enough for this specialized audience, I don't know, but it's likely my internal conflict that's keeping you awake as I confess my story and what's at stake, as I risk looking stupid, immoral, as I work to justify my self-exposure and the exposure of those I love. In my old nightmares, before I was disowned, before I published or performed a single honest word about myself and my family, I was buried alive. Soil and snakes and roots and worms suffocating me. I woke wrecking the shades, clawing at curtains, hands pressed to the cool of window panes. Then after I lost my family, when I could not stop writing confessionally, my mother pursued me in my dreams, sometimes with my father and my siblings in tow, through a recital hall or a theater, after a poetry reading I'd given, or the performance of a play I'd written about them. There mystified, aggrieved, enraged, seeking an explanation for my cruelty, calling my name through cross currents of crowds. As I wake up, I barely slip away. My sister's words have stayed with me. I do feel that writers have a responsibility to not only be truthful, but also to not cause harm with their words. I confess I do feel this too. It's dangerous to write about oneself, but more dangerous still to write about others. Like many here today, probably I've written many things that have hurt many people's feelings. One of my first plays was inspired by a year I spent acting, or more accurately, carousing, at a pub theater in Cork City in Ireland. I intended my play as a kind of love letter to a surrogate family that had welcomed me when I was lonely. And while far from a docudrama, the play's characters were modeled on people I knew at this theater. I was in the play too, or somebody a lot like me. As a dutiful playwright, I gave the character of me a sprinkling of flaws and felt it was only fair and artful to provide the other characters with flaws too. I was back in the US and living in New York when I sent an early draft to an Irish friend who happened to be in the play as well. She wrote back soon after, I'm not going to do an accent, "Dan, why on earth would you write something like this about your friends?" I never heard from her again. A mentor of mine at the time, a Broadway producer, told me to shrug it off. Losing friends is what writers do. That was her quote, not me. Since my Irish play, I have approached true stories with caution. I've written 2 plays, 2 poetry collections, and a libretto about the Pulitzer Prize-winning war reporter Paul Watson. We worked together for 10 years. But those years included 2 when we were little more than pen pals, emailing back and forth about anything and everything, movies, sports. We had to win each other's trust. This is why a biographical or documentary play involves a massive investment of time and energy, more of both than is required when writing other kinds of plays, with the possible exception of history of plays, or as I like to think of them, documentary plays in which all the characters are dead. But a history play doesn't run the risk of fizzling or flashing out in a pile of ashes, a common enough disaster when one is dealing with living subjects. I spent a few years getting to know a 70-year-old activist and self-proclaimed anarchist in Los Angeles, even going so far as to travel with him to the mountain jungles of Chiapas for the 30th anniversary of the Zapatista uprising. His eldest son, resenting a childhood in which the family had been hounded by the FBI, left home in the 70s for a scholarship to an elite school in the Northeast and an adulthood with an anglicized name and a career in high finance. This was the play that needed to be written. This father, this son, activism and anarchy, capitalism and conformity, but the prospect of such a play proved too personal, too revealing, too shameful for both father and son. Perhaps the best advice for a playwright setting out to write a true story about a living person is to find somebody who possesses the same compulsion for self-examination and recrimination and revelation that afflicts you. Paul Watson, as a journalist and photographer, was already an artist, certainly a storyteller. He had previously written a memoir that was shockingly, sadomasochistically, some might say, candid. He carried within him the moral injury of witnessing some of the worst war zone atrocities of the last quarter century in Mogadishu, Rwanda, Kosovo, Iraq, Afghanistan, Syria. The list goes on. His post-traumatic stress disorder manifested as a sense of uncleansable shame that he was never able to alleviate any of the suffering that he witnessed. Shame that he was profiting professionally by documenting trauma for the consumption of our mass market media. For most of his career, he thoroughly expected to be kidnapped, tortured, killed in the crossfire, And when it happened, he would welcome this retribution because he believed it was deserved. He was suicidal adjacent. He lacked the courage, he said, to kill himself, or he often told me. So instead, he would insert himself again in the middle of another war where a stranger might do it for him. Paul's depression reminded me of my brother, and this sense of an echoing kinship was what drew me to him in the first place, hoping to understand him, to help him, as if I could, with my art. I've said that the basis of my creative relationship with Paul Watson was trust, but something else or more was happening. I had a talk back following the performance of my first play about him. An audience member asked Paul why he had responded when I reached out to him all those years ago. Paul didn't know why. He simply felt compelled, he said, to tell me his true story and to let me try to retell it as poetry, as a play. It felt eerie, he went on, this urge to confide in a stranger. A psychologist might say that a sense of the uncanny indicates an unconscious objective, but Paul explained it this way: Dan is my confessor. And some in the audience gasped because they knew that the burden had been transferred again. They had seen the play. They had heard his shameful tale, and with any luck, they had forgiven him. My objective when confessing currently has less to do with my shame, or my shame solely. I confess primarily so as to publicly transgress a cultural taboo, to write honestly about an experience that many would rather not entertain, would rather not take action to address and redress for a range of reasons, from complacency to defensiveness, to our ancient yet everyday fear of death, the now perpetual massacring of innocents by untreated psychopaths with limitless and casual access to weapons of war. This is one subject in need of a cultural confession if we wish to awaken empathy and work toward any sensical solutions, but more of that in a few minutes. To empathize with the confessional work of art is to, at least in part, sense our shame as bystanders and to feel compelled to absolve our shame with action. When I was disowned by my family, I was dismayed to learn that some friends were ashamed on my behalf. They wished I would reconcile with my family as if it were up to me, as if reconciliation can excise cruelty. Several years ago, when my wife was diagnosed with cancer, and 6 months later I was diagnosed with cancer too, many friends and strangers arrived to help, and many other friends and strangers wanted nothing to do with us. I saw clearly that cancer, like any formidable illness, is a taboo. Perhaps illness is the taboo. So I wrote about cancer. Writing was my way through the ordeal, if there was a way through. Just as when I was a boy, when I could not accept that my suffering and the suffering of my brother was shameful, I needed to make sense of it. I needed to make my shame comprehensible, meaningful, and thereby beautiful to myself and hopefully to others, so that I might feel less alone. Writing confessionally was simultaneously a plea for help and an offer to help, and I still believe that today. When I teach, I suggest that writers write what scares them. I don't see the point otherwise. Writing with fear, toward fear, and through fear is as useful in the creation of a comedy as a drama, by the way, as a comedy without danger is at best a confectionery diversion. In my case, and this will probably come as no surprise, by now I tend to write dramatically, even tragically. The true story that scares me is about gun violence, and specifically about a tragedy that has already and unforgivably been repressed into the memory hole of our country's recent history, the mass shooting at Sandy Hook Elementary School in Newtown, Connecticut in 2012. Many of us have seen or read plays that fictionalize the problem of guns, and many of these plays have, as they say, impact. They stir an audience and they elicit discussion, but also, I suspect, smug condemnation. I worry that fictionalizing certain societal shames lets the audience off the hook. A based on or inspired by play may blunt or diffuse the trauma, though such a treatment may provide a more tolerable, even pleasant, even entertaining experience for the audience. These plays present an illusion of truth as they offer an illusory, that is reductive and impractical, answer to the issue at hand. And in the end, the audience doesn't feel galvanized to do anything differently outside the cozy confines of the theater. To confront audiences, of course, playwrights must confront themselves. Our biases, limitations, and fears, yes, but also our urge to deny. I have felt queasy, viscerally vulnerable as I familiarized myself with the primary source documents related to that day in Newtown, as I speculated on the psychology of the shooter and his parents, as I absorbed some small measure of the grief and rage of the parents of the victims. But a writer can and must draw on similarities in their histories for fortification and for pathways toward an unspeakable empathy. Years of writing about my childhood had prepared me for an encounter with the shooter's mental illness and the dysfunction of his family. I would not have been able or willing to dramatize the cause and the effects of such extreme violence without the practice of writing about Paul Watson. And perhaps cancer has desensitized me to catastrophe. I still feel the urge to look away. I feel it strongly. I feel it right now. But I know that I am privileged to be able to witness, and in witnessing, I feel some measure of responsibility to tell others what I see. I've read portions of this play to audiences, as I did a few nights ago, as I've been writing it, and many seem to understand what I'm after, but some are disturbed by it. Speaking to me, they have sounded a lot like my sister. Writers have a responsibility to not only be truthful, but also to not cause harm with their words. One audience member was concerned that my play might inadvertently glorify the actions of the murderer. Her brother, she told me, had been inside the Century 16 movie theater in Aurora, Colorado, also in 2012, when a shooter opened fire, killing 12 and injuring 70. Her response to my play was confused and confusing to me. She was re-traumatized by the play, and for that I felt and feel badly. But some part of her wished I hadn't written it, because probably underneath everything, and like all of us, she wished that the shooting hadn't happened, that it isn't happening. Just weeks ago, a dramaturg friend, emailed me. He wanted me to know that, in his professional opinion, my play about Sandy Hook is unstageable. Reading it, he wrote, gave him blunt force trauma. He's an American who lives in London now. Do Americans really want to experience something like this? He asked. And my honest answer is, I don't know. We'll find out. The play will premiere at Jiva Theater next spring. I haven't written my dramaturg friend back yet. Maybe I never will. What I can offer in response to his criticism, I will say to you, the trauma in the play is a trauma that every American lives with every day. When I take my child to the mall or to a theater, and I have no choice but to imagine the eruption of automatic gunfire from some unforeseeable shadow or window, when I must plan our escape, when I must mentally prepare to throw my body over my daughter's body, as if the caliber of bullets available to anybody and everybody in this country can't rip through piles of bodies at once. When my daughter, 9 years old, must crouch quietly beneath her desk in her locked classroom with her agitated classmates, with the shades drawn and the lights out, drilling their response in the unlikely event of an intruder, this is the blunt force trauma. This is the shame. It is the shame that must be confessed, and a penance in the form of solutions must be groped toward, collectively, in a theater, in my small, perhaps inconsequential case. I'm not a politician or an activist. Theirs are not my talents, but I can write something, and maybe incrementally what I write will matter. Maybe in this way one day I can be forgiven by my child. This is the final section for those keeping score. The theater, as we know, is dead or dying, or it's always been dying. This has always been part of its charm, its analog allure, its elemental, almost sacred promise of mystery and consequence. But there's little allure or mystery or consequence in the theater these days. Times are bleak and there's no denying it. Pandemic relief funds are gone, as are audiences, or audiences are slowly, too slowly, returning. Subscribers aren't subscribing. Same with donors and donating. Why pour money onto the decks of the Titanic? Enormous regional theaters like LA Center Theater Group and Dallas Theater Center are pausing, curtailing their seasons while laying off staff, while upcoming productions of vital, groundbreaking plays are postponed indefinitely. The Humana Festival of New Plays at Actors Theater of Louisville, under the radar at the Public Theater, gone. Powerhouses like Oregon Shakespeare Festival are in existential crisis. This is to say nothing of the countless mid-sized and small companies, many with decades of productions behind them, that have expired. The list is long and growing longer every day. Most theaters are doing what they can to remain fiscally afloat with revivals of classics and crowd-pleasing musicals, and of course, the perennial life raft Shakespeare. If producers are looking for a genuinely new play at this point, most are seeking, if they're looking for a genuinely new play at this point, most are seeking, as playwright, critic, and educator Carrie Dodd-Svitch often points out, hopium for the masses. Pure escapism, plays that furnish an audience with a fiction of toxic positivity, a theater of denial. And this is to say nothing of the talent that has exited the field as theater artists turn to more sustainable careers in film and TV, or in unrelated careers altogether. Film and TV writers aren't having an easy time of it either, of course. I should know, I'm married to one. But at least those that write stories for our screens have a union and healthcare and the option and leverage to strike. In the words of my playwriting agent, everyone is sad. It was midway through 2020 when it hit me, belatedly probably, that my art, a means of personal and professional expression to which I had given 20-odd years of my life, my young years, maybe my best years, was disappearing, at least contracting, atrophying, at least for a while, and probably a long, long while. I'm embarrassed of what I said here 2 years ago when I stood at this very lectern rhapsodizing about a near-future theater culture and industry transformed by the tumult of the Trump and COVID era, a new theater capable of confronting and transcending the trauma of our times. I believed then that the need to face and learn from the truth outweighed our need to deny it. I was naive. Where does that leave me? How do I stand up here and teach and inspire early career playwrights today? Where does that leave every one of us? How and why does one persist in writing plays when so few theaters will produce them? So yes, I am sad too. But I have never been particularly comfortable with sadness. My typical response to a challenge is madness, in both senses of the word. I mentioned recently to a playwright friend, also hyphenated, that I am still writing plays because I am clinically compulsive and addicted to disappointment. He suggested that these words could easily describe all playwrights, probably all writers. I am mad also in the sense that I'm angry about apathy and denial, angry about an outdated, bloated production model that has failed playwrights for so long, and I know what I want to do. It's not a new idea. It is a return to basics for me. I want to write plays that, in the words of Antonin Artaud, will function, quote, like an open door leading the audience where they would never have consented to go. In short, a door that opens onto reality. Artaud was mad. and we are all a bit mad if we are choosing to persist in writing plays. Since the onset of my writing life, I have consoled myself rather pathetically with the notion that a lack of commercial reward at least provides artistic freedom for the playwright. If that is the case, then we have never been more free than we are now. So let us make an unencumbered, unfettered record of our dystopia. Let us write to dispel the fog of hopium. Let us write with brutal honesty our plays about fascism and demagoguery, the curtailment of our civil rights, our unabated ecological catastrophe, our concomitant biological plagues, and the plague of mass delusion and deceit. Let us write our record of our time. It is the only time we have. And speaking of time, let us have patience while we write with the urgency of a confession. Hopium may dull the pain for a while, but it won't cure our communal condition. Every vital reinvention in the theater has been accomplished with the truly new. And often it was years after an initial cultural crisis when the new, honest, often shockingly transgressive play found a theater and theater artists courageous or reckless enough to produce it. The audience will find us in time. Like I found the confessional poets, decades after their heyday, on a dusty shelf in the library. I found them when I needed them, when I was ready to hear them. And one day the audience would be ready to hear what we have written, our confession of the chaos and confusion that we are surviving. And they will be thankful that we wrote it, and they will forgive our honesty and our shame as they forgive themselves. Thank you. Thank you.